This is Stephen Branting. I'm the institutional historian for Lewis Clark State College in Lewiston, Idaho. Welcome to the fourth in the series of Zoominars concerning the history of the Lewis Clark Valley, the college, and people who came here and gave it a heritage. Our topic today is a rather interesting one that came out of some unusual research. That topic is going to be concerning people who came here from other countries and served as veterans of other countries. That's a topic that is a little bit unusual for most people because of the scarcity of it. We don't see that very often. So today's topic is warriors under foreign banners. This is something that I was intrigued with by walking through cemeteries to see names of that had French flavor to them, or Czechoslovakian, German, Russian. So in order to do that. But before I begin, I want to give a huge shout out to my colleague in France, Julien Lozelli. Julien has been an absolute wonder in helping me to make the Swiss cheese of my stories into more of a camembert, to give it some body. And I really do appreciate it. So Julien, thank you so much. I saw you logged in. I know it's very late in Nantes right now. In our topic today, I'd like to look at what is found in Lewiston, Idaho. If you walk through Normal Hill Cemetery, it's not going to be unusual for you to find a veteran of the Civil War. Here are four photographs that we have of men who served for both the North and the South. Not unusual. Some people will walk by them without even thinking. But when you start looking at the Civil War, we find 75 to 80 of them. We know a few that are still buried in Pioneer Park. They didn't locate their graves and exhume them. And then we get into, well, we have a couple of examples of people from the Indian Wars. We have three buried in Normal Hill Cemetery from the Mexican War of 1846 to 48. And then we get to the Spanish American, and then it becomes more common to see veterans buried here. And when we get to Memorial Day and Veterans Day coming up in November in a few weeks, we see a lot of flags. Well, these men, you put American flags, but we're not really going to look at that. So we're going to go a little bit farther back in history. We're going to start today back with a man who was born in 1795, Moses Jacob Grostein. And you'll notice there's going to be a bit of a format here. I'm going to start out each of these biographical sections with a picture of the gentleman's grave or where they're buried. And when we get to the very last individual, Gerhard Bottger. Gerhard Bottger, his ashes are still in his urn, and he's going to be buried with his wife when she passes away. So very different situation. Well, Grostein, born in 1795, was from a small town of Rypien in Poland. And when he was growing up as a teenager, somewhat like Toby Tyler and the circus, you know, the old story about running away to the circus because it would be so much fun. Grostein got enthralled with Napoleon. And you're saying, why? Well, a lot of Polish nationalists were thinking that Napoleon would allow them to reconstitute the old Duchy of Poland, which had fallen into disrepair and had been basically non-existent for a few years. And so he thought that maybe this would be an adventure and it might lead to the reestablishment of a nationalism. So he left home and went with Napoleon in the invasion of Russia. Now, there was a legion of Polish soldiers called the Vistula Legion that had been recalled from Spain. They had been fighting Wellington in Spain. They had been recalled to make this invasion, this great invasion into Russia. And Grostein got involved at the Battle of Borodino. Now, this is a artist rendering of Saxon cuirassiers. Well, in English we say cuirassier, but in French it's cuirassier. It is a reference to the breastplate that lancers and mounted heavy cavalry would wear. And this is part of an artist rendition at the Battle of Borodino when the Polish lancers clashed with Russian cavalry. And this was part of the battle that Grostein was in. Well, at the Battle of Borodino, which was fought on the 7th of September, 1812, was a massive loss of life. The Russian forces numbered about 155,000. There were 180 infantry battalions, 164 cavalry squadrons. This was a massive grouping of Russian troops. The French came into the battle with 128,000 troops, 317 squadrons of cavalry, because Napoleon loved his use of cavalry. A lot of artillery, more than 600 pieces of artillery were set up. Well, the fighting involved about 280,000 men. Grosstein's one of them. The Russians lost an estimated 40 to 45,000 dead, wounded, or captured. The French, somewhere between 28,000 and 35,000 dead, wounded, and captured. This was the bloodiest battle of the Napoleonic Wars, and would see the bloodiest day of combat for 100 years, until the First Battle of the Marne in 1914. Well, of course, Napoleon goes into Russia and comes back home, and comes back through Poland, and goes back to France, and is deposed and sent to St. Helena and all that story. We all know that. But what happened to these people, these Polish people who had sided with him, the Vistula Legion? Well, Polish nationalism led to a revolt in 1830, and Russians invaded. And by that time, Grosstein knew that he had to get out of the way. He had to move. A later biography said that he had been in sympathy with Napoleon, to whom he had rendered active assistance. That's the wording in 1903. And it continued, for this reason, he was obliged to flee from his native land. And so Grosstein moves to New York and settles in Buffalo. Well, as we go along, his son, Robert, comes to the West Coast, because Buffalo, there's a lot, here we're looking at people trying to kind of get their feet on the ground. Idaho, the Washington Territory, all that thing was ripe for development for people who were merchants. So Robert moves to the West Coast and comes to Lewiston. Now, this is a picture in about 1905 of him. So we're looking about 50 years later after he came to Lewiston. But he comes to Lewiston, becomes very wealthy. This is the old Grosstein home that used to sit about where Palucci's is on Main Street. This about across the street from the Liberty Theater, which is going to come into the discussion here in a moment. Robert comes to Idaho. It was a thriving community, but it was a rough and tumble community. When he moved here, he related later in life that the first night he was here, a man was murdered on Main Street. These were the Jewish community. But in 1867, his brother-in-law moves to Lewiston with his family. Now, on the right, we see Abraham Bernard, and in the family portrait, which was taken just after Abraham's death, I have just highlighted his wife, Rachel Bernard. Now, why did they come into the story? As Grosstein got older and his wife had died, he moved to Lewiston, Idaho, and moved in with Abraham and Rachel. Now, we don't have any pictures of Moses. That's unfortunate, but we have pictures of his family. And the picture on the left of the family was taken inside the home where he lived his last years. He died in 1886. Now, Bernard's family stayed in the community for some time. They are gone now. And I'm just going to point out one person in this picture, and that is Isaac Bernard, who's standing behind his mother. Isaac Bernard was the entrepreneur who established the Liberty Theater. I just mentioned where the Grossteins lived across the street. It's ironic that the home was on one side and the theater was developed on the next side. Abraham was a very unusual man. I just want to just note something about him before we go on. He was a very imposing man. He was over 6 feet tall, which was quite tall for the 1860s and 70s. He was a member of the Lewiston School Board, and he was once in a while would be on a vigilante committee, which was very common. And he got really upset with cowboys who would be riding their horses down the sidewalks. Well, the sidewalks were wooden, and they'd just tear the sidewalks to shreds. So he got really upset with that. And he was an inveterate fisherman. His wife, Rachel, used to say that the only way to get him to come to dinner was to send boys out. She'd pay some boys a few pennies and stuff. They'd go find out where he was, and they'd throw rocks in the river in order to discourage the fish and make him to come home. So it was a very, very odd family. But this is the family. Moses Grosstein goes away as a young man, fights with Napoleon, and then makes his way to Lewiston, Idaho, and dies in a home on Main Street. The old Bernard home was down across Main Street from the Lewis Clark Hotel. which is basically right close to the bridge going into Washington. The next person we'd like to talk about is Charles Lefrançois. Francois is buried here. He was originally buried in Normal Hill Cemetery, and his grave was moved to, Pioneer Park. I'm sorry. He was buried in Pioneer Park in the old Fifth Street Cemetery, and his remains were moved, we think in the 1890s, over to Normal Hill. And this is his headstone, which has been placed in a concrete plinth because it had fallen over. He was originally from Alsace-Lorraine. Now, Alsace-Lorraine has been a hotspot for France and Germany over the centuries. It's right on the border. You hear people speaking French, you hear people speaking German, and so it's been fought over. This has been the avenue through which a lot of invasions have occurred. So he was born in Alsace-Lorraine, but then when he was growing up, wanted to go into military service. And so he entered into what is called the École de Cavalerie. We say cavalry. This was the prestigious school in Saumur. And when he went here, this is a very old postcard, he went here in order to train for the cavalry. Now, he was born the year that Napoleon was defeated. And in 1837, Charles graduated from this school. It's not very far away from the famed auto racing city of Le Mans. We probably heard of that, of the 24 Hours of Le Mans. It's very near Le Mans. And he comes out of the school, was promoted to the rank of captain, and was posted to Algeria, because at this time the French were they're going through the conquest of North Africa, and this is what he probably looked like in uniform of the time. This is actually a photograph of a cavalryman from the early 1840s who was stationed in North Africa, in Algeria and Morocco. And we do know of two incidents in his life. The first one, and this is how a cuirassier would have dressed in battle when he was all seated out. He was among 500 French cavalry who surprised and defeated the forces of an Algerian resistance leader in May of 1843. They just overwhelmed the camp and rode in. And then in August the 14th, 1844, Lefrançois led another contingent of cavalry at the Battle of Isly in Morocco, and they routed a large force of resistance fighters in Morocco. So we do have some indication of what he looked at. Again, no photographs have survived of him. It's unfortunate that happened. Here we see a artist rendition of the taking of the camp at the Battle of Isly in Morocco. Remember, here's Charles Lefrançois, a captain in the cavalry, taking part in this action. After this fighting in North Africa, Lefrançois finds himself between a rock and a hard place. He was a very ardent supporter of the Second French Republic, and that had been formed after the Revolution of 1848. But there was a movement to restore the monarchy, and he just was not going to take that. So he resigned his commission and moved to California. And then in 1861, he moves up to the Camas Prairie and builds a way station. They call it the Frenchman's. And it was on the divide between the Camas Prairie and the Salmon River in central Idaho. At that point, a woman enters his life. Now, this is a very much later look at her. Her name was Melanie Bonheur. She was from Paris and had moved to Idaho in the early 1860s. Most people would remember her as Melanie Lefrançois because they married in February of 1863. She owned the Hotel de France in Lewiston. And so Charles sells the ranch on the prairie, comes to Lewiston, they get married just a month before the Idaho Territory is created. Charles did very well in the local business community. He was called an upright, industrious man. One recount said he was highly esteemed as a good citizen by all who know him. And in 1872, when they did a survey of wealth in Nez Perce County, they found that he had liquidity of about $9,500. Now, that doesn't sound like much liquidity, but today that's about $210,000, just money that he could invest. We're not talking about property. We're just talking about liquidity. So he was not having a hard time. And this is not his wife's wealth. It's his. She was separate. He didn't have good health. He wanted to work as being a surveyor for the city. He did, of course, was found around the Hotel de France, and we see this in 1884. But by 1884, Charles was dead. His heart began to fail, and he died in February of 1874. Again, we're sorry to say we have no photographs of it. Now, you're going to say, oh, I hope we have photographs. Yes, we do. Be patient, okay? And we're going to be patient just up to the next one, okay? So let's go to our third one, and that's Jean-Baptiste Spec. Now, Mr. Spec, his headstone here is here in Lewiston, both him and his second wife, Wilhelmina, or Mina, they called her. We get a look at him in this portrait from the late 1920s. And again, on the right, we see how he would have dressed in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71. So as Lefrancois was living in Lewiston, and he was a county surveyor, he was becoming well established in Lewiston business community, this man was being called up for service to fight against Prussia, Germany, as we would think of it today. The picture on the right is the 2nd Regiment of the Cuirassiers, French Cuirassiers, and that is his regiment. Now, where he served was very unique because the Franco-Prussian War was a disaster for the French. It did not take very long for the Germans to overwhelm them. And that was basically the battle that just absolutely finished the French off was the Battle of Sedan. And even at the battle of Napoleon III, the Emperor of France, was captured by German forces, Prussian forces. And we see the charges of the 2nd Regiment in an artist's rendition. Cavalry still highly used. I don't know why people had not gotten the idea, because both the French and the Germans were no longer using percussion cap rifles. They were using what were called needle guns, what we would call center fire today. They were bolt action, and they could put up a tremendous fire against these cavalry charges, but they were still using them. Well, once the war is over, Spec moves immediately. He takes a boat. He says, I'm not going to stick around here. And he takes a boat in New York and ends up coming to Lewiston and marries a couple of women. Now, his first wife is on the left-hand side. This is Mina Eichenberger. Mina was the daughter of a very wealthy Swiss merchantman here in Lewiston. The Eichenberger building is still standing on Main Street on the north side in the 500 block. That was her father. She marries John and then dies a couple years later, soon after the birth of their son. And so John remarries Wilhelmina, or Mina Kling, who was first married to Fred Kling. Now, those of you who are from Lewiston or know anything about Lewiston know there used to be a stationery store in Lewiston called Kling's. As a young man, or well into my adulthood, I used to shop there all the time. It's now closed. That was this woman's son who ran that one. Now, Wilhelmina Kling Spec was a very, very important nurse. And you may remember her picture from our discussion of the nursing section, the nursing discussion of the history of the nursing in Lewiston. So here is 2 wives. Their house was down in the 1600 block of Main, and it was one of the last houses in Lewiston when it was torn down to have one of the old white picket fences around the front of the house. You may remember a few slides ago that the Grostein home had a white picket fence. That was very common because the residential section of Lewiston was on Main Street, not on Normal Hill or in the orchards as we do today. It was down in the middle of town. So there were shops. The business district was about the 1st Street to 6th Street. And then all of a sudden you got into the residential section. Our next person is Peter Gottfried Tervueren. And Tervueren was from right on the border between Germany and Netherlands. He was a little town called Summersum, okay? Or Homersum, excuse me. I kept saying Summersum. I don't know why I say that. Homersum. And this is an old lithograph showing the church that was still standing when he was there. He was called up, ironically, on the Prussian side of the Franco-Prussian War and served in the Prussian infantry, a picture of which we have here. This is a small unit of Prussian soldiers showing their dress, how they were sent into battle. And Tervueren was at the Battle of Sedan. He even wrote of his experiences there. He was so thoroughly discouraged by it that after he mustered out, he said he would never fight or let his sons fight in another war. And in order for them not to be called up, conscripted, he actually moved to the United States. Now, we have one picture, and here's an artist rendition of Prussian infantry. This is the taking of Paris when the German Prussian forces finally made it toward Paris, which led to the Paris Commune, which it's a whole another story. But Torbern had moved, and Speck had also left by that time too. But we see even the Prussian cavalry in Paris had lined up with artillery when they entered the city. Interesting note about Torbern. He comes to Lewiston in the 1890s, finally makes his way here, moving across the United States, and moves to Clarkston, where he became quite an orchardist. There were many accounts. You go back into the old newspapers, and you'll find references to him as being a real model for growing certain kinds of trees. And this is one of his apple trees. It was a photograph I found from 1905, which shows us some of what he was doing. He kind of embraced this whole agricultural part of the community and was well known as a civic leader in it. And then he died. Of course, all these men are all dead, of course, many years ago. We turn our attention to an American. Now, we've been talking about Polish, French, and Prussian, but William John Scott was an American. While Torbern was establishing his orchards, Scott found himself caught up in an international crisis. Scott had graduated from the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign in 1895, and he was doing a tour around the world. He was saying, I'm going to take some time off and just go traveling. Well, he and three of his companions found themselves in South Africa when the Boer War broke out in 1899. They were in the war zone, and they found themselves pretty desperate for provisions. Scott later wrote, he said, this is what a letter he wrote. He said, so doing the only thing we could do other than starve, we put our names upon the dotted line, and passing the test became members of the regiment, the Scottish Horse. So here we have a man who finds himself in really dire circumstances, no money, can't leave the country. So in order to do something, he signs up for the military and ends up in the British Army. And we find out this is what he would have looked like on horseback. This is a member of the scouts for the Scottish Horse. Ironically, my wife's great uncle was a member of the Lord Strathcona Horse from Saskatchewan, and was also in South Africa at the same time. The Scottish Horse was established by Lord Kitchener in November of 1900, and they fielded 3 squadrons out in the field. Well, Scott got his initiation into combat in May of 1900. He was riding in advance of a column of Derbyshire Regiment, what they're sometimes called the Sherwood Foresters, and they were named Flonfontein in the Transvaal. Well, Scott spotted some Boer horsemen way out in the distance. So he and his buddies turn around and head back for the regiment. And by the time he got there, he found that the artillerymen of the regiment were fighting hand to hand with a division of Boers. And so they tried to get themselves in a position where they could help. This is an artist's rendition of how that action took place. They established defensive positions by a near hillock so they could cover return fire, and they narrowly escaped being captured when they were taking the horses to safety. Well, the Derbyshires finally fought off the Boer attack at very great cost. They had 18 dead and 17 wounded. And we have a picture of the Derbyshires. This is an old picture, a grainy photo that showed up in an old publication. And that night, when Scott got back to the camp, he was assigned a detail to go back out and pick up the wounded and the dead. Now, they didn't go during the daylight. They went out at moonlight. And he said that they got people off a battlefield, and that when they were coming back, they would pass Boer wagons, rescue parties, their wagons were laden high with bodies, and they would pass each other quietly under this moonlight. And then on the next day, which happened to be America's Memorial Day, he watched the crew dig this long trench in the African soil, and they buried 68 of his British comrades. Now, he'd be later captured and would spend several weeks as a prisoner of war. Now, we do have a picture of him. This is William Scott. Excuse me, my brain's going. I think my medication's out. William Scott. When he was working, he trained as a veterinarian, got his veterinary degree, excuse me, from the university, from what they called Colorado Agricultural College at the time. Got his veterinary degree, but he had been quite a journalist. So later in life, we see articles written about him. He would cover certain events in the area, the region of the United States that we live in. But he took his veterinary degree, taught in Colorado, and then moved to Clarkston, where he was a supervisor for Clarkston's adult night school, which was rather unusual. And he would write occasionally for the newspaper. And here's a picture of him in 1941, not too long before he died. He died very suddenly in 1941. So, but you never know where you're going to be when you get impressed into service. Now, we come up just a few years, because our next man is Wilhelm Bernhard Diem. I happen to have met Mr. Diem more than 50 years ago. In the spring of 1968, while I was doing my undergraduate work in European history, I found that he was living in Lewiston. Now, you're asking, why am I showing you a tree? This is the weeping mulberry. It's in Marshalltown, Iowa. This is where the ashes of Wilhelm and his wife Sophie are buried. They were living here, died here, and their ashes are here in Iowa. So I wanted to kind of pass along. I appreciate the family sending the pictures. The Condi family have been very helpful in bringing this back to my memory, because I remember sitting with Sophie and Wilhelm, or Bill as we called him, at their place in the orchards, and I'll show you some pictures of him later in life. But he was always making his wine. And so he offered me a nice glass of wine, and Sophie had just made some black walnut cookies. Well, how could you pass that up? Well, Wilhelm was born in Michelbach, Germany in 1895. By the First World War, when the First World War broke out in August of 1914, the German Navy and Army mobilized very quickly. They were much more efficient in that. And so he was almost immediately brought into service. And you'll see him here with one of his friends and their the sailor's cap for the SMS Derfflinger, on which he was stationed. We have another photograph of him that came in from the family quite nicely. And this is, again, he is on the left, and we see him with his brother on the right, his brother Frank. It's nice to see where you see the family taking the kind of ceremonial pictures before going away to service. Well, he found himself in the German Navy in the Baltic. Now, it didn't take long for the German Navy to kind of get skittish about it, because the SMS Blücher was sunk in the Battle of Dogger Bank in January 1915, and Kaiser Wilhelm got really very, very skittish about sacrificing these big battle cruisers. They were kind of cherished by him. He didn't want to lose them, and so he pulled them back into port. After a while, the German Navy's submarines began to wreak havoc on Allied shipping, and the fleet was more willing to go out into the North Sea. That is where we pick up the story. And this is where the story picked up when Bill and I talked. He told me about these accounts. So I want to pass them along to you, because now we're getting firsthand accounts. It's just not history. It's actually knowing the people. This is the Derfflinger, on which he served. It was a heavy cruiser, and it was in the German North Fleet, the Baltic Fleet, if you want to call it that. And they went to sea and met the British Navy off the coast of Denmark at a place called Jutland. And in this battle, Bill recounted seeing the following events. These two things happened. These were the British cruisers, Indefatigable and Invincible. German gunners were very proficient. They didn't have radar at the time. They used optical sighting with what is called stadimeters. It looks like a sextant on its side, and they could find the range to ships as long as you could see it out of the water. You knew how tall it was to certain smokestacks. You could bring to bear your big guns. And we see both of these ships going down. The Indefatigable sinking on the left, and the Invincible actually exploding. The other event that he witnessed was the exploding of the HMS Queen Mary, which just went up in a huge explosion. Now, the effect of this was pretty dramatic. When you go back and look at the actual disaster caused by this, you would find that when these three ships that we just talked about, what Bill was watching, when they went down with 3,309 men and officers. Only 17 survived the sinking of those three ships. I had photographs of these with me when Bill and I spoke on that afternoon in 1968. I can remember him looking at them and looking at one especially very carefully and reading the description at the bottom, which had been provided by the War Museum, the British War Museum in London. And he was shaking his head. And I said, sir, why? Is there something wrong? He says, the caption on this is incorrect. I said, I have to, that's all I have. He said, I can tell you why. He said, I was standing on the railing of my ship, the Derfflinger, and watched the ship blow up. He said, the description's not quite right. And I was stunned. I really was stunned by this, because of his being able to firsthand recollect this had happened over 50 years in the past, and he was still very sharp about knowing exactly the events that led up to it. Now, after the war, Bill told me he went back to Germany, and he said the economy, everything was so in turmoil because there had been a blockade of Germany by Britain that his hometown was unrecognizable. And as a result of that, he went back to sea and went into the Merchant Marine. And this is actually a photograph of him in his passport, his papers for the Merchant Marine. Now, as he comes to the United States, a lot happens. He anglicizes his name. He starts working in New York City. He worked on the Holland Tunnel. He met his wife, Sophie. And then not long after they got married, he learned that his entry into the United States had been illegal. So he picks up his family. By this time, their daughter had been born, Louise, and they go back to Germany for an extended stay to establish the proper visa status. And then they come back to the United States, and Bill and Sophie became U.S. citizens in 1930. Well, let's bring him to Lewiston. The couple showed up in Lewiston in 1935, and they bought a house the next year, a little 10-acre farm in 1936 at 11th Street and Powers Avenue. The old barn, which is just falling into pieces, and the old house are still there. I remind you, just not as I remember it 50 years ago. And he was known to his neighbors as a wonderful agronomist, because he cultivated acres of vegetables and fruits, especially strawberries. And in the mid-1950s, he vied for a seat on the board of the Lewiston Orchards Irrigation District. Very vocal man concerning this. This picture on the left, we see, I think, about 1938, and then on the right, 1945, when we see his daughter, who was a Lewiston High School grad. He was very vocal, especially after the Lewiston Orchards was annexed. There was a change of tax status, and the Idaho State Tax Commission reassigned the orchards from irrigated agricultural, which it had been for decades and decades, to suburban. And that raised everybody's property taxes substantially. I remember that very well, because my father was none too happy. We lived in the orchards as well, in an old established area of the orchards. Well, Bill moved away from Lewiston and died in January 1983. And he and his ashes are buried back there. Lovely photos of the family. especially the pictures here. And I have one more picture, which this is how I remember him. This is Bill in about 1970, just after I talked to him. And you can see we're looking on the wayside back up toward 11th Street. And people would come out, and he'd have all these rows and rows of strawberries. People could come out and pick them. It was a wonderful memory for me of seeing him like this. I do miss that conversation, I tell you that. Well, let's turn our attention to the next gentleman. His first name was Paul. He went by Paul Alfred Arnault, and he went by Arnold. You'll see his headstone. His original name was Arnold. Right? Arnold was, let's say, a kind of a wayward youth. When he was growing up, he was living in France and moved away from home. He had a very difficult life, okay, I should say. He lived with his grandmother. His father and grandfather had died. His mother was confined to a mental institution. And by 16, he had taken off, okay? He just was going to go on his own. So he moves. By 14, we find him on his own near Paris. Well, in 1890, in September 1890, he was sentenced to 3 months in jail and fined about, today's money, about $490 for stealing money from a resident of the town where he was living, just west of the capital. Well, the tribunal judges were lenient. They thought, well, look at the boy's circumstances, and we'll give him a little slack. Well, Paul, or Alfred, had a little bit of an obligation coming up. He was getting to the age where he was going to be called up for military duty, which was mandatory. And guess who skips town? Indeed, he skipped the country and headed for the United States. And in the United States, crazily, he comes to the United States. He doesn't, wait around for his call up. He gets out of the country, and he enlists in the United States Navy. Now, I don't see any rhyme or reason that. Why not just stay home and serve your duty? But he comes here, and we think he served aboard the USS Chicago. We don't have absolute confirmation of that because there was no Sixth Fleet at the time, which is Mediterranean Fleet for most people. But he served in the United States Navy for more than 3 years. And we know he was in the Mediterranean because he commented a few years later that he had visited his family in France. He'd come into French ports and had kind of surreptitiously traveled the country when he was on leave and met up with his parents again. And that will come back into the story because here's a young man who leaves his country, is in the American Navy, and then his conscience begins to hurt him. So let's follow along the story about this unusual man. The first mention of him shows up in the Lewiston Morning Tribune of August the 18th, 1899. And let me pull out a little bit of a thing here. He'd gotten into a brawl on Main Street. He was listed as a riverman, which meaning there were a lot of things. He was probably working on a steamboat. He said a minute later, Arnold was prostrate in the street. Well, he got into a fight with a guy, and the guy had taken some bottles to him. They were 4 bottles of beer is what it was. They got to fighting over it, and the guy went to wailing on him and knocked him senseless. They had taken to the doctor. Well, this case kind of dragged on for a while because who was at fault here? And it turned out that Alfred had gotten pretty well drunk and had assaulted this gentleman. His name was Whalen, and had started this fight. And he ends up paying the fine and doing some jail time over it. Now, in order to get a little of his aggression out, he starts taking up boxing. Now, in the meantime, he's been arrested for selling liquor on the Nez Perce tribal reservation. On one occasion, he was shot in the face during an altercation. He needed something to do. And so he took up boxing, and he took up the name Frisco Frenchy. You'll see that in the first paragraph, mentioned in the last paragraph too. This is a little blurb out of the Tribune in December of 1903 of this upcoming bout. Now, I have to tell you, for a man who was a roustabout, getting in the ring in what we call local smokers, he most often would get a good thrashing by a superior opponent. He was a small man, wiry, but he was no boxer. Now, this became a problem because Alfred married Laura Pierstorff. Now, the Pierstorff name is still kind of current around here from the Camas Prairie. He gets married in June of 1905. And in September 1906, he got drunk and beat her up. She was pregnant, and he beat up several neighbors before the police got him under control. Well, Laura put her foot down, and Alfred cleaned up his act. And at that point, there was one more little problem he had with the law in October 1908 was assault with a deadly weapon, but that was taken care of. But he still got himself he put himself too close to the fire. And it involved these two men. Now, this is Clarence Robnett and William Kettenbach Jr. on the right. In 1909, Alfred formed a real estate business here in Lewiston dealing with timberlands. And he got into a very close relationship with Clarence Robnett, who was the head cashier, which is basically the manager of the Lewiston National Bank. Now, he got into so close of a friendship with Robnett that the U.S. Department of Justice hired him as an informant. Because you see, Robnett had been embezzling from the bank. And Robnett's employer, William Kettenbach Jr., was being investigated for improper timber sales, which were millions upon millions of dollars of fraud. And so he became an informant and testified before the what we would call the FBI today, the grand juries. Kettenbach, it took a presidential pardon from Woodrow Wilson to keep Kettenbach out of federal prison for 10 years. Robnett moved away, tried other schemes, fell flat, ruined other people financially, and then finally lived out of his life quietly in Spokane, Washington. But here is another situation where Alfred was too close to the fire all the time. You know what? The French didn't forget about this young guy. They had been looking for him all this time. Remember, he had left the country, not been called up. Notice I've got Julian was kind enough to translate for us. You'll notice that the translation had that he had disobeyed the call for young soldiers of his class. So he's declared absent without leave, AWOL for Americans. He was dismissed off that in 1908 and then was declared again absent without leave. They were looking high and low for this guy. Well, it was all of this is going on. He's married, he has children, he's living in Lewiston, he goes into real estate, and then the First World War breaks out. And when the First World War breaks out, we have just a couple of illustrations here of what was happening. When the First World War broke out, he had nearly 15 members of his family were called to combat duty. Now, if you know anything about the First World War, my wife's great uncle was in the Canadian infantry, was wounded in the First World War. Battles were, remember we talked about the Battle of Borodino being bloody? Well, these are the ones where the French were still marching into battle in red trousers and red caps. Now talk about a target. And they would march in line as we see on the right. There was no skulking up around the tree like a guerrilla. It was just in mass because the French felt that if they overwhelmed you by their very spirit of the rightfulness of their cause, they could always win. Well, that didn't prove very successful against German machine guns. And so the death rate was immense, absolutely immense. And at that point, we were seeing things like this of just masses and masses. At the Battle of the Somme in July 1916, the British Army in the single morning had 19,000 killed on a single morning in battle. So this, Arnold's conscience got the better of him. And guess what? He starts to write letters to the French consulate in San Francisco. Here's a copy of a letter. And you'll notice it's saying, a German may not think nothing of his oath, but a Frenchman do. But if you see I can do anything to help the cause of France, he's saying, let me help. What can I do? He's writing this one because he's feeling very bad. He told the consulate that he was feeling this, his conscience was killing him, that he had come over. In 1917, the United States enters the war in April. And he had, at that time, 4 children. He was too old to be drafted in the United States. So he became even more desperate. And in September, he queried the consulate again about going into the French Foreign Legion. doing anything. What could he do to get back into duty? And we have here a copy of the letter that came back from the consulate. And basically what we're looking at, it's saying that he desires to come back to France to do his duty, okay? And the writer of the letter says, is this under your control? And if that's the case, he says, je le repatrie, I'll repatriate him in order for him to, and I'm waiting for your response. And he was finally repatriated and allowed. They sent him his money to travel, his tickets aboard ship, and let him come back to France to join the 18th Infantry, which went back into combat in September of 1918 in the Third Battle of Aisne. And the regiment earned colors, what they call the Médaille Militaire, on their lanyards, which was common at the time. So here he is, finally kind of repaying something he had given up 20 years before. When he comes back to Lewiston, this is what he probably looked like. I have scoured the countryside. I've talked to every member of the surviving family. The Arnauds are related to the to families in Lapwai area. So there are still some descendants, but not close enough to find any photographs. But this is what a veteran, and they called them poilus, P-O-I-L-U. A poilu, French means a hairy, hirsute, you know, and they were old men. It was an endearing term. It wasn't derogatory, but this is what he would have looked like at the time. Well, he comes back to Lewiston, comes back to home, and now this is a photograph looking from the old Harry Barnett home, which is the home is long gone. This is looking into Pioneer Park. This is 3rd Avenue. So just to orient you, you can see the Lewiston Hill on the right-hand side. That's the old Supreme Court Library. And Arnaud comes back to Lewiston and comes back and lives in his home. And just on the sidewalk, you'll see there's a walkway to a home. And this is the home. This is the old Arnaud home. It was torn down in 1951 when just the descendants of the family finally tore down the house. He had gone back into work in real estate, and the French government still tried to have him come back, and they finally said, no, we're going to just give up on you. Go back and whatever you're doing, raise your family in the United States. The old Arnold home sat on 11th Avenue. It was torn down in order to make the parking lot for the St. John's Clinic that sits at St. John's Way and 3rd Avenue. They built over the site. The addition on St. John's is now on that site, but it was torn down for that. Very interesting man. And Julian just did a wonderful job giving, like I say, filling in the holes of my Swiss cheese, because all I was seeing is what I saw in Lewiston, and there was so much more behind the story of this. Our last man in this is Gerhard Bodger, who was a good friend of mine. I taught with him at Lewiston High School. 3 years after Arnaud returned to Idaho, Gerhard, whom we see in his urn that's kept by his family, was born in August of 1922 in Chemnitz, Germany. That's near the border with northern Austria. Okay, his father had been an officer in the First World War, but had died when he was a small boy from tuberculosis. He'd been a POW in the First World War in St. Petersburg, Russia. Very interesting story behind this. So when World War II breaks out, Gerhard is just a teenager, okay? 1922, 1939, you see he's just turned 17 years old. And he goes into service. He wanted to be on submarines. He thought that was great. Now, Gerhard wasn't a very tall man, but he wanted to be on submarines. But because he was the sole child of his mother, the German government wouldn't allow that. So he was assigned as a signalman on a minesweeper in the Baltic. And in 1944, in late 1944, he started in participating in what was called Operation Hannibal. It was a mission to evacuate an estimated 2 million Germans when Germany was beginning to be invaded by the Russians. Now, there was what we sometimes called East Germany. There was a little section of it over near Poland, and they had to get people out of that area because the Russians were starting to invade. Now, here we see just a snapshot. I'm very indebted to his daughters, Heidi and Evelyn, and their brother and his son Gary, for these wonderful photographs they've gotten in the albums. And of course, this is much earlier than I ever met Gerhardt. You can see him in the center with the glasses, the field glasses, serving board ship. Wintertime, of course. Now, another person enters the story, and because it is quite a story. The little girl second from the left in the front row is Hildegard Arndt. This picture, don't have the exact picture, but she was 6 years old when the major events took place. She was much younger than Gerhardt. In January of 1945, the refugees are fleeing from Danzig to the west, trying to get away from Russian forces. And Hildegard's mother booked passage for the family aboard a major ship, the Wilhelm Gustloff. It was a luxury liner that had been converted to a hospital ship duty and now was carrying refugees to safer port. Now, the family arrived too late to get on board. They just missed it. And so they had to wait for another boat. Well, within a day, on January the 30th of 1945, Russian submarine S-13 fired 3 torpedoes into this ship on this side, okay, on the port side. The ship went down. It has been, they have located, they've been mapping it. And out of an estimated 10,000 passengers, only 1,200 survived. 5,000 children died aboard this ship. Gerhardt's future wife would have been aboard with her family. She just, ironically, they missed the ship and it saved their lives. So we see other pictures of Gerhardt now here with refugees. Remember, he's on a minesweeper in the Baltic trying to move people out. Another picture with this. I don't know whether they just dragged him out of the water or what they did in this picture. He looks so funny in the middle there. I just loved it. Well, move ahead in time, and we find Gerhardt coming to the United States. He had studied engineering in Germany at a technical institute, and he found his way out of East Germany in December 1956 and settled in Dearborn, Michigan, where he attended the Henry Ford Community College. And then later, I didn't know this, he and I never spoke about it. He went to Eastern Michigan University in Ypsilanti and earned a master's degree in geology. And he met Hildegard in a crowd greeting the arrival of German President Theodor Heuss. They were at Ann Arbor Airport, and they met by accident. She had come to the United States in December 1957. And as the family said, he asked her out several times, and she'd say 9. And he finally won her over, and they got married in July of 1959. Well, he became a citizen in 1964 and brought his family to Lewiston. And he became a teacher at Lewiston High School. He liked Lewiston. He and Hildegard loved Lewiston because it was low population, the scenery was beautiful, and he moved here to start teaching. He taught mechanical drawing and small engine repair at Lewiston High School, and he was Teacher of the Year in 1981. In 1984, he was the University of Idaho's Alumni Association Teaching Excellence Award winner in 1981. He was a wonderful man, pleasant. It was a laugh a minute. Just had the most fun. Our son Spencer, who was one of his students just a young teenager, just dearly loved him. We do miss him quite a bit. He died in 1999, a little more than 20 years ago. So what we've looked at here, my friends, is actually a story of 8 men who had these very odd and diverse experiences all over the world. Russia, South Africa, in the seas off Jutland, you name it, and they had to experience these things, and to hopefully come back and look at it and get it down in writing and catalog it has been a real joy for me. And I hope you have enjoyed a look at 8 men who were warriors under foreign banners. Have a wonderful afternoon. Hopefully you enjoyed the discussion, and you have a good day, a good evening. And Julian, if you're online, get some rest. So goodbye, everyone.